Walker talks about his new book, The United States of Paranoia, in which he discusses the popularity of political conspiracy theories and paranoia going back to the founding of the country. This is about 45 minutes.
Typical politics and prose fashion, our author events are timely. While today we present a book dealing with an American history of conspiracies, just 3 days ago, the CIA admitted that such a place known as Area 51 does actually exist. Even though they disavow all knowledge of any aliens, so-called conspiracy theorists rejoiced.
I think they just silenced the conspiracy theorists.
Now, the best way to sum up Mr. Walker's book is from page 8, where he says, pundits tend to write off political paranoia as a feature of the fringe. They are wrong. The fear of conspiracies has been a potent force across the political spectrum from the colonial era to the present, in the establishment as well as at the extremes. So all 338 of Jesse's readable pages lays out in clear, often funny, and as well often surprising detail how that is still the case. Now, one present day but now old conspiracy that I talked with Mr. Walker about while we was waiting, that I personally remember made its rounds through the internet and everywhere, was the folded $20 bill trick right after 9/11. Anyone familiar with that by show of hands? A few folks, but not everybody. Jesse lays it out on page 302, the $20 trick. If you fold a $20, for folks that don't know, if you fold a 20 just the right way, it alleges to show how the World Trade Towers are up all ablaze. If you fold it up right, it supposedly has it on there. Allegedly foreshadowing 9/11 attacks. Now, for me, items like that can easily be dispelled as quackery, but some other examples, so-called conspiracies, might take about 50 years for the real information to come out and the truth be exposed. Speaking of truth being exposed, they coming for me right now. So Jesse Walker is a books editor, senior book editor at Reason Magazine, University of Michigan alum, who's also written Rebels on the Air, an alternative history of radio in America back in 2001. You can follow him on Twitter or on his blog page. See, they coming for me, so they got me flustered. The perpetual 3-dot column at jessewalker.blogspot.com. He resides right up the way in Baltimore with his wife and 2 daughters. I now present you Jesse Walker and his second book, The United States of Paranoia, a Conspiracy Theory.
Should I take the book?
Hey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit from the book, then I'm going to talk a bit about the book, then there will be a shooting, and then I'm going to read a little bit more from the book, and then we'll take your questions, as will the police. So, on January 30th, everyone hear me in the back? This okay? Great. On January 30th, 1835, as Andrew Jackson exited a congressman's funeral, an assassin drew a weapon and pointed it at the president. The pistol misfired. The gunman pulled a second weapon from his cloak. Though loaded, it too failed to fire. The cane-wielding Jackson and several bystanders subdued the would-be killer, an unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence. Lawrence later informed interrogators that he was King Richard III, that Jackson had killed his father, and that with Jackson dead, money would be more plenty. He was judged insane and committed to an asylum where he died 3 decades later. Lawrence was a lone nut. Or, at least, that was the official story. It wasn't long before 2 witnesses filed affidavits claiming to have seen Lawrence at the home of the Mississippi Senator George Poindexter shortly before the attack. Poindexter was a noisy opponent of the Jackson administration, and pro-Jackson newspapers accused the senator of plotting the president's murder. So did Jackson's allies in Congress, who quickly convened an investigation. Jackson himself told bystanders after the assault that the shooter had been hired by that damned rascal Poindexter to assassinate me. Some of Jackson's critics countered by suggesting that the president had staged the assault to gain public support, and that this explained why both weapons had failed. And many Jacksonians pointed their finger at John Calhoun, the South Carolina senator and former vice president, arguing that if he had not been directly involved in the assassination attempt, he had at the very least incited it, with a speech denouncing Jackson as an American Caesar. That's what they did back before they could compare you to Hitler, I think. So when the Republican writer John Smith Dye described the crime 29 years later, he saw an even more devilish plot at work. Calhoun might not have been directly involved in the assault, Dye conceded. Whether this man was induced to attempt to murder the president by listening to his defamer-making speeches in the Senate, or whether he was secretly hired to assassinate him, God alone can determine. But Dye believed that Calhoun had been a part of a larger force, the slave power, that would have benefited if Jackson had been put in the ground. And the slave power, Dye informed his readers, was more than willing to kill a powerful man to get its way. In 1841, for example, President William Henry Harrison told Calhoun he wasn't sure he was willing to annex Texas, which Southerners wanted to add to the Union as a slave state. Harrison promptly died. Officially, the cause of death was pneumonia, but Dye was sure that arsenic was to blame. 9 years later, Dye continued, President Zachary Taylor opposed the slave power's agenda in Cuba and the Southwest, and so he was killed by the same poison. And when President-elect James Buchanan prepared to make some appointments of which the slavocrats disapproved, Dye declared, he narrowly survived one of the most elaborate assassination plots ever conceived. On February 23, 1857, according to Dye, Southern agents poisoned all the bowls containing lump sugar at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. Southerners, he explained, drink coffee. Coffee drinkers use pulverized sugar, so the Southern diners would be spared and the tea-drinking Northern diners, including Buchanan, would be wiped out. The future president barely survived the illness that followed. Intimidated by the attempted assassination, Dye wrote, Buchanan became more than ever the tool of the slave power. And there is little evidence for Dye's explosive charges. You can make a case that Harrison's doctors did more to hurt than to help the ailing president, but no more than conjecture supports the idea that anyone deliberately killed him. Coroners debunked the belief that Zachary Taylor had been poisoned when his body was exhumed in 1991, and Buchanan was not even present in Washington on February 23, 1857, though dysentery did break out at the hotel when Buchanan stayed there a month earlier, and again when he returned for his inauguration. Today, the outbreaks are usually attributed to a sewage backup that contaminated the inn's food and water, but at the time several stories circulated blaming poisoners for the illnesses, with the suspects ranging from a Chinese cabal to a band of homicidal abolitionists. Inconveniently for Dye's tea and coffee thesis, the dead included a Southern congressman, John Quitman of Mississippi. But when Dye's book The Adder's Den was published in 1864, the country was at war with the South, and when a new edition appeared 2 years later, under the title History of the Plots and Crimes of the Great Conspiracy to Overthrow Liberty in America, the nation was still reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. In that atmosphere, a book that feels like a 1970s conspiracy movie set in the antebellum era received a respectful notice in the New York Times and was excerpted in the Chicago Tribune. Republican papers praised it in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Trenton, and New York City, and in Pennsylvania, even the Democratic Easton Express proclaimed it the most powerful book of this century. Nor did Dye invent his theories from nothing. He drew on rumors that had been floating through Whig and Republican circles for years. After Lincoln was elected, well before Dye's book appeared, several supporters of the incoming president sent letters warning him to watch out for the plotters who had killed two of his predecessors. General Harrison lived but a short time after he was installed in office, one concerned citizen pointed out, and General Taylor lived but a short time after he took his seat. You, sir, be careful at the king's table what meat and drink you take. Another letter informed Lincoln that I have often heard it stated by physicians that it was an undoubted fact that our last two Whig presidents, Generals Harrison and Taylor, came to their sudden and lamentable ends by subtle poisons administered in their food at the White House. After Lincoln died, at least two prominent ministers, George Duffield of Detroit and William Godwin of Connecticut, worked the supposed murders of Harrison and Taylor into their sermons. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher not only invoked their alleged assassinations in an article for the New York Ledger, but added the anti-secessionist Democrat Stephen Douglas to the list of victims, writing that he had been killed because his position in the party made him one of the most efficient champions against the rebellion. During the effort to impeach Lincoln's Southern successor, President Andrew Johnson, Representative James Mitchell Ashley of Ohio brought up the same old accusations, declaring that Harrison, Taylor, and Buchanan had been, quote, poisoned for the express purpose of putting the vice presidents in the presidential office. And in May 1868, an extraordinary article in the New York Tribune managed to out-die Dye, accusing a Democratic conspiracy of engineering the city's malaria outbreaks. After commenting that Zachary Taylor fell under the malarious vapors of Washington and died because he was prone to acting honestly and straightforward, the Tribune writer claimed that Washington in subsequent years was free of malaria, that is, for Democrats. But when the new Republican Party began to gain strength, and it was possible that they might become the ruling power in Congress, the water of Washington suddenly grew dangerous. The hotels, particularly the National, became pest houses, and dozens of heretics from the Democratic faith grew sick almost unto death. The contagions continued until Lincoln put the walls and springs of the Capitol under the care of loyal soldiers, ending the outbreaks. But after Lincoln was deposed, the pattern returned. Right before the vote to impeach Johnson, we had a return of that bad water, and 2 or 3 senators, Republicans, mind you, are prostrated with sudden illness. What does it mean? Why does it happen that whenever the current sets against the master demon of slavery, and never at any other time, we find the air and the water and the whiskey of Washington full of poison? That would be a great name for like a bar, by the way. The assassination theorists weren't the only Americans worried about conspiracies of slaveholders. Dye didn't coin the phrase slave power. The term was common currency in the North, where it was used to describe the political influence of the planter elite. This was not in itself a conspiracy theory, but it often adopted a conspiratorial coloring. In the words of the historian Russell B. Nye, the slave power had an alleged agenda to extend slavery to the territories and free states, possibly to whites, and to destroy civil liberties, control the policies of the federal government, and complete the formation of a nationwide ruling aristocracy based on a slave economy. Lincoln himself believed that he could clearly see a powerful plot to make slavery universal and perpetual, and in his famous House Divided speech he engaged freely in conspiratorial speculation. Senator Henry Wilson, later to serve as Ulysses S. Grant's vice president, put the idea bluntly: slavery organized conspiracies in the cabinet, conspiracies in Congress, conspiracies in the states, conspiracies in the army, conspiracies in the navy, conspiracies everywhere for the overthrow of the government and the disruption of the republic. Meanwhile, Southerners had elaborate conspiracy theories of their own, blaming slave revolts, both real and imagined, on the machinations of rebellion-stoking abolitionists, treacherous land pirates, and other outside agitators. It was a paranoid time. In America, it is always a paranoid time. Right. So that's how the book begins. I'm going to tell you a bit about what else is in it, and then if I don't go too long at that, I'll read you a little bit more. Basically, this is a history of political paranoia in America, and when I say paranoia, I'm using that word colloquially, not clinically. I think that virtually everyone is capable of being a conspiracy theorist, of political paranoia. And when I say everyone, I include you, me, and the Founding Fathers. The first half of the book sets out 5 recurring, and I should add also, the 2 sort of assumptions people have made when they hear about the book is either that it's an attack on conspiracy theorists or that I'm espousing all my favorite conspiracy theories. Neither is true. I mean, I'm frank about it if I think a conspiracy theory is nonsense. I also discuss some conspiracies that genuinely did happen. I mean, I have a chapter on the 1970s investigations of the Church Committee and so on, after Watergate, that exposed various awful deeds of the CIA and FBI and so on. What I'm really interested in is the stories that keep getting told again and again. Sometimes just they sound familiar to just put some different names in them. And what those stories say because even when a conspiracy theory says absolutely nothing true about the objects of the theory, it says something true about the anxieties and experiences of the people who believe it. They're a form of folklore, and if they catch on, that's something that's worth paying attention to. So the first half of the book lays out sort of 5 primal archetypal conspiracy stories that are told over and over. I'll give you their names. You can inquire more about them in the question and answer if you'd like. They're the enemy outside, the enemy within, the enemy below, the enemy above, and the benevolent conspiracy, because sometimes they're conspiracies that are supposed to be the good guys. And then the second half of the book looks at the last half century of American history through the lens with the toolkit of the that I set out in the first half of the book, sort of from Watergate to Waco to the War on Terror. And I look along the ways at sort of the rise of a sort of self-conscious conspiracy subculture, also the rise of what I call the ironic style of conspiracy theorizing, which is people who aren't so much interested in either espousing or debunking a theory, but just having fun with it, maybe building one of their own that says something, maybe looking at other people's and mining what sort of laughs or metaphors or what have you they can find there. And I also make sure to look at the conspiracy theories of the establishment, which aren't always called conspiracy theories, but often when there's a moral panic afoot, all sorts of conspiratorial notions are taken very seriously in government, in the mass media. And the most extreme recent example would be the satanic ritual abuse scare of the 1980s and 90s, but there are others as well. And oftentimes something that sounds like and is, a fringe theory in one decade can suddenly have a version of it be promoted by very central American institutions, mass media and so on in the next decade, and then fade again. So I mentioned the ironic style. One thing at the end of the chapter on the ironic style, I talk about a couple of writers who created such vivid conspiracies for fun that they wound up sort of going down a rabbit hole and believing them themselves. One of them came back from that trip around the bend. That's Paul Krasner, who edited The Realist, writer worth reading. And the other who never came back from around the bend was Carrie Thornley, who was co-founder of a sort of a mock religion called Discordianism that was supposed to worship Eris, the Greek goddess of chaos. Was a big influence on the Illuminati trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson, which is sort of a classic cult novel, of sort of a parodic treatment of conspiracy theories, and who also had the distinction of serving in the Marines with Lee Harvey Oswald. And when Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, Thornley thought this was interesting and decided to write a novel about him. Didn't get published till many decades later, but it's still probably the only book written about Oswald before the Kennedy assassination. So, jumping into the other section I'm going to read, Thornley managed to get drawn into the JFK assassination circus. Jim Garrison, y'all remember Jim Garrison? He's better known, I think, as Kevin Costner these days. He was the New Orleans DA who was investigating the Kennedy assassination in the 60s. Jim Garrison tried to get him involved in his investigation of the Kennedy killing, and after Thornley rebuffed the DA, Garrison started suggesting that Thornley himself had been a part of the plot. Garrison put out a press release claiming that the Discordian had been closely associated with Lee Oswald, not just in the Marines, but at a number of locations in New Orleans in September 1963. Thornley gave a deposition before a New Orleans grand jury at the beginning of 1968, and the experience convinced him that Garrison's team wasn't interested in justice. Among other things, the team members seemed intent on pigeonholing him as a Birch-style conservative. I explained several times to them that I am neither a traditionalist nor a nationalist nor a racist, that I oppose the John Birch Society and what passes today as political conservatism, Thornley wrote shortly afterward. I went on to say that I am a right-winger insofar as I favor individualism, but my rightism is more anarchistic than authoritarian. They looked at me blankly, not seeming to hear. As Garrison's allegations spread through the underground press, Thornley put out his side of the story in every venue available to him. The subscribers to Ocean Living, a low-circulation zine that Thornley helped edit, were surely surprised when the material they were used to, a typical article informed readers that plankton can be gathered in nets and used as a nourishing foodstuff, was now mixed with statements by assassination theorists criticizing Garrison for his pursuit of Thornley. Garrison was soon spreading the story that Thornley, who bore some physical resemblance to his Marine friend, had served as a double for the accused assassin, posing as Oswald in the time before the president's murder so as to create a false trail of Oswald's activities. As he fended off Garrison's attacks, Thornley reconsidered his assumption that Oswald had acted alone in Dallas. In 1973, he read a feature in the yippie tabloid Yipster Times that would later be expanded into Canfield and Weberman's book, Coup d'etat in America. Thornley wasn't just convinced. He began to suspect that he really had been involved in the assassination without his knowledge. A hypnotized zombie held in reserve in case something went wrong with the Oswald plan. He started typing up his speculations, boosted by new memories of things that he believed had happened to him years before, and he circulated the manuscripts among his contacts. After that, he perceived various odd events as the secret government's reactions to those memorandums. Some of the incidents would scare anyone. At one point, armed bandits in ski masks had raided a party he was attending, stealing Thornley's identification along with everyone else's money. But Thornley was also capable of accusing his girlfriend of working for the conspiracy. He wrote to Greg Hill being the other founder of Discordianism, he wrote to Greg Hill, "I am literally surrounded by the intelligence community." That's back when literally meant literally, by the way. So I am literally surrounded by the intelligence community, but after the first 3 attempts to murder me, things seem to have cooled down, and most of the spies now appear to be on my side. At one point, he became convinced that a co-worker at the Sunshine Floral Company was really Robert Anton Wilson, living incognito with Timothy Leary in Atlanta for reasons I obviously could not fathom. He wondered whether the collapse of the New Left was caused by foreign intelligence agencies dosing organizers with a substance causing heart disease, thereafter maintaining control over them by means of a microwave device capable of instantly halting a pacemaker. By the 1990s, he believed that he was the product of a Vril Society breeding/environmental manipulation experiment. In the midst of this, the real Wilson cut off his correspondence with Thornley. It was hard, he told Adam Gorightly years later, to communicate with somebody when he thinks you're a diabolical mind control agent and you're convinced that he's a little bit paranoid. Thornley continued to write, sometimes with wit and self-awareness, sometimes not. He spent the last few years of his life working at menial jobs in Atlanta and selling trinkets and essays on the street. It was a chaotic conclusion to a chaotic life, a darkly poetic fate, I suppose, for a man who worshipped Eris. "You know," Thornley told Hill in one of his more lucid moments, "if I had realized all of this was going to come true, I would have chosen Venus." So it's almost 7:30. Should we have questions now? All right. Questions, accusations, applause? Yeah. Yes?
Could you tell us what motivated you to write on this topic?
It was a payoff by I started reading sort of conspiracy theories in my teens, actually reading those sort of serious exposés of the CIA, the FBI, and so on that came out following the Church Committee reports and so on. And often they were on the same shelves, I found, as books that were not quite as reliable, but often fun to read. And around the same time also, I discovered things like, the Illuminatus trilogy, the Church as a Subgenius, the whole ironic style, and this whole sort of subculture of people who could appreciate conspiracy theories without necessarily believing all of them or going all the way constantly into, the freak out that someone believes something that isn't true. So that's that was the origins of the interest. This book. I wrote it in the last few years, but I draw on interviews I did as a journalist in the middle of the 90s, covering stuff about the militia movement and their unexpected intersection with black nationalists and so on, often around conspiracy theories. So I've had a long time of writing about this to build on.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
If I read your mind correctly, you leave the impression that all of the American public is subject to a degree of paranoia, and can be unconsciously developing conspiracy theories. Is this partially what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to use 100 words like all. You know, there's always someone then who could stand up and say, or be in a coma or something, and therefore not be having a conspiracy theory. But I think that there's three things that kind of go into. I hate to make any reductive explanation of where conspiracy theories come from, because they come from all kinds of places, and it's not like there's a particular type of person who is, you know, susceptible or whatever. But there's three things that are sort of all going on. One is that we naturally seek patterns. We naturally create narratives, tell stories. That's how we make sense of the world. We organize things into stories. Number two, we constantly have things to be afraid of, and gaps in our knowledge that we're then creating stories about to explain the world. That makes you prone to conspiracy theories, that combination. When you throw in the fact that sometimes people really do conspire, it's not like being afraid of, you know, werewolves or sea monsters, that, you know, you can actually point to COINTELPRO and say, well, that one happened. I mean, the chapter about the 1970s investigations, part of it is going on about what actually happened. I mean, the actual bona fide conspiratorial behavior, but also talking about how that kind of lowered the bar for what people were willing to believe. I mean, once you've heard that the CIA did this, you start to imagine maybe the CIA did that. And then when it starts going into pop culture, and we get all those great movies that came out around that time, that in turn also influences the way people form their narratives. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Question for a conspiracy theory to spread, of course, it has to be picked up and done. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the internet. It makes it so easy now to spread, maybe easier than ever. Is that going to be, it also can be corrected, but does the internet have or do you see the internet having an impact in the future on conspiracy theories now, and as I say, in the future also? Yeah,
and not so much on the quantity as in the velocity with which they spread, and also the ways they mix. I mean, and really in the 1990s particularly, this had been building before the 90s, but in the 90s there was this sort of golden age of you know, the militiamen and the hippies and the black nationalists and the UFO guys. They were all reading each other's stuff. And you could have all sorts of odd combinations, or what might seem at first to be odd combinations, emerge. And that has only intensified since then. So.
Thank you very much.
What's the difference between just kind of, or what makes the difference between just misinformation and a conspiracy theory?
Well, two things.
There's a lot of misinformation. They don't all become blown up in, and I'm thinking about like the death panels with Obamacare. Yeah,
you know, and I actually, I struggled with whether or not it was right to describe death panels as a conspiracy theory in this, and I think I did. I mean, because they do have that conspiratorial image of people in a room condemning people to death. But so your question is, like, where do you draw the line between?
Or what?
I mean, I guess you draw the line at the point where someone invokes a conspiracy. You know, I mean, one thing that there's two things that bother me about the way the phrase conspiracy theory gets thrown around. One is, as I said, that if they're embraced by major social institutions or a lot of people, they're not considered conspiracy theories, or at least not until it's in retrospect. Usually. And the other is oftentimes just anything that challenges dominant social institutions or the conventional wisdom gets called a conspiracy theory, even if there's no conspiracy involved. Some say, I think it was Mother Jones recently had like a top 9 conspiracy theories about Obamacare, and I think maybe 2 of them actually involved conspiracies. They were just, you know, wanting to, you know, mock these ideas by calling them conspiracy theories, but most of them weren't. I don't know if does that sort of dance around answering your question?
No, that's right.
All right.
It's tricky.
I can agree with you that it seems like Americans are especially subject to conspiracy. I say I can see that it's easy to imagine that Americans are especially susceptible to conspiracy theories. But is there any hard evidence that that's true in comparison to other countries?
No, I don't.
Any quantitative information?
I don't claim that it's true. I mean, I say at the beginning that I'm talking about Americans because this is me looking at American history through the prism of, you know, the things people have been afraid of. But obviously, I mean, for all I know, the French are scared to death of everything. You know, I don't. I mean, it's clearly, you know, Russia, Middle East, many countries you hear about conspiracy theories. Although I assume that the dominant, the style is going to differ from culture to culture. But the only sort of conspiracy stories from abroad that I cover are the ones that had influence in America. So, but yeah, I'm not making a quantitative claim.
Great.
You've yielded to an American tradition, which is to kind of minimize our relations with Latin America. And Latin America, as you probably know, you perhaps know, is full of ideas of everything, practically everything the United States does. There's a CIA conspiracy behind it. But to me, the lulu of this was I was attending a meeting at the Johnson Library and ran into, he had been, who was it, Donnie? He was in the cabinet. He was secretary of the cabinet of Johnson. Anyway,
we'll call him Mr. X.
Mr. X said, "You don't realize that Castro was getting ready to kill Kennedy." Well, as a matter of fact, I had interviewed Castro many times, and if there was anything, he had been looking forward to Kennedy coming into the administration as a matter of generational understanding. He said that it was impossible for Eisenhower to understand where he came from because Eisenhower belonged to another generation. But Kennedy, who was coming at that time, Kennedy was about to take office, had already been elected. And he said, I'm very hopeful. And this was an official interview. I was taking notes for 5 hours. And he said, he said, well, I'm looking forward of an improved relationship. And I was ready, I was leaving, and he called me back. Oye, ven, pero no lo van a dejar. But they will not let him. And they, of course, was what Eisenhower called the military something establishment.
Industrial complex. Right. Thank you.
Do you talk anything about like economic conspiracies and you know, the gnomes of Zurich and people ascribing things to forces beyond their control? It bedevils people, I think, these days, and surely there must be a conspiracy there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, in fact, the chapter on the enemy above, you know, I mean, part of what I trace in there is sort of the this isn't the gnomes of Zurich, but the evolution of sort of always seeing the enemy above as being in or trying to capture the state, you know, or, I mean, if not in the state, then in a secret society trying to seize the state, and gradually that sort of expanding to include, you know, corporations. First, things like the Second Bank of the United States, which was a creature of the state, and railroads, which are subsidized by the state, and gradually just all the, you know, the trusts and so on. So yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of economic-related conspiracy thinking in here. So.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fascinating topic, but overall, and I want to stay with you on this higher plane. What do you do about conspiracy theories that so divide our country when we have no institution with the credibility to address and resolve these competing views of reality? And I'll just take the 9/11. You know, there's the government case, and then there's the architects and engineers case, which says that the government's case is not possible under the laws of physics. So, you know, that's pretty compelling dispute. So what do we do when faced with conspiracy theories that are incredibly divisive?
Well, boy, there's a few things in there to unpack. I mean, as far as conspiracy theories can be divisive, but they're also a product of divisions, right? I mean, social divisions are kind of inevitable, although sometimes you can have more than others, and that's part of what produces conspiracy theories or conspiracy suspicions, is wondering what's going on in, the other faction, and of course then they turn around and reinforce it, but I don't think there's like some magic bullet that can end social divisiveness, and I think that there's always going to be, genuine debates over the proper direction for the country, and so I wouldn't want to eliminate all divisiveness. You need to have yeah. Anyone else? No.
Could you just give an example of the 5 categories that you listed?
Oh yeah, yeah. The enemy outside. I mean, they're kind of self-explanatory, but the enemy outside is the 2 classic models of it that are the fear of the Native Americans and Native American conspiracies, and the fear of the Roman Catholic Church. And while the Indians were sort of seen as this kind of unruly, anarchistic alternative or sort of threat, and the church was seen as sort of the aristocratic old world trying to reimpose its hierarchies, there were, of course, all sorts of imagined ententes between the Catholics and Indians. But that the enemy within, well, I'll come back to that one. The enemy above is the conspirators at the top of the social hierarchy. Enemy below is the fear of people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, because people in power have conspiracy theories too. I get into a discussion of, in particular, I talk a lot about fears of slave revolts. And historians often have a very hard time looking back and telling which slave revolts actually happened and which were just slave owners freaking out because they saw people talking and then brutally cracking down. The enemy within is someone who's not easily identified by where they're from or their social status or their ethnic or racial background as a possible agent of the conspiracy. The enemy within is the neighbor, coworker, even someone in your family who might be one of the pod people, right? It's and then the benevolent conspiracy is sort of working behind the scenes to make life better. It would include people who have these great visions of Rosicrucians, founding America in secret and trying to create a higher destiny. Also, a lot of the benevolent extraterrestrials, the angel fad of the 1990s. In a lot of ways, UFO people sort of secularized old ideas about higher powers, and then the angel folks then resacralized it, but sort of drew on that that body of storytelling. So.
I wonder if you could take a few minutes and walk us through the Kennedy assassination, the Warren report, the conspiracy theories that were prevalent then, and maybe the conspiracy theories that are prevalent now.
A few minutes, you say? Yeah. I'll say, the Kennedy assassination is one of those things, you heard in the Kerry Thornley section, it keeps popping up. I don't have like a chapter devoted to it or anything like that. But what I will say about it is that, and setting aside questions about, obviously one thing that drives it is people saying here, anomalies, I want to investigate it, I don't buy what the Warren Commission says, I don't want to just psychologize the entire thing. People can have questions based on their reading of the evidence. But nonetheless, I noticed that the conspiracy theories, or even sometimes just other forms of paranoia that aren't conspiracies, don't involve conspiracies, that catch on at different times in reaction to the Kennedy assassination parallels other fears going on in society at that time. So that in 1963, on the one hand, the president is shot in Dallas. There's this sort of big fear of the radical right at that time. Lots of people worried about the Minutemen, the John Birch Society, and so on. There's this instant assumption that Oswald must be an agent of the radical right or a member of it. Then it comes out that he defected to the Soviet Union for a while, had activism, or sort of pro-Cuban activism, as conspiracy theorists will say, appeared to be pro-Cuban activism. And so that fed into Cold War fears. And there was the natural sort of anti-communist conspiracy theories. As the New Left built, there was more and more fears that maybe the government was in on it. And then in the 70s, with the post-Watergate investigation, that breaks through. You know, there's a wave of books talking about blaming the CIA, the FBI, and so on. Even as late as the first Bush administration, HW, there were people who were saying, well, he was in the CIA before we knew he was in the CIA, and he was involved with it. I mentioned Paul Krasner. Actually, this is not in the book, but he continued in The Realist to publish conspiracy investigations along with joking conspiracy investigations and not labeling which were which. And he ran a piece by someone who actually fabricated some stuff trying to implicate Bush Sr. in the Kennedy assassination, and then ran like a notice saying that, you know, this guy, you know, lied to me. He claimed this was there, that it wasn't there. And I asked him, you know, well, since you're famous for having a magazine that doesn't label what's journalism and what's satire, did you just sort of move this from one category to the other? In retrospect, he says, no, I was just livid. So I mean, of course, what I just said can't cover everything. I mean, the mafia theories are an evergreen and so on, but I do think that that's one way of sort of looking at the Kennedy assassination through history. So, another question?
One question about maybe the intersection of conspiracy theories and, say, investigative journalism. Mm-hmm. You know, we hear so much more, I'd say, within the last 10 years about the Freedom of Information Act, and it seems like there's a much greater awareness of the idea that, oh yeah, after a certain period of time, such and such documents will be released in some form or another. And we've seen a few noteworthy incidents where some pretty serious information did come to pass when the documents were released. Have you seen sort of any trends that are emerging, in terms of maybe these aren't things that have become big enough to become full-blown conspiracies, but within maybe that certain community of people who are actually doing the investigations? Well,
I mean, investigative journalists, I mean, often they're exposing or seeking to expose, legitimate conspiracies that exist. So, and often, if someone is denigrating an investigative journalist's work, they will say, conspiracy theory, and often if someone is maybe a bit on the nutty side, they could still try to dignify what they're doing with the phrase investigative journalism. But there's, just as there are conspiracy theories that are true and some that aren't, there's good investigative journalism and bad investigative journalism. You mentioned FOIAs. I actually had a FOIA I put in on someone I write about in this book come through as I was checking the proofs. I had to add stuff. It's become, not in that case, but it's become actually more difficult to FOIA a lot in the last decade. So if anything, I think the sort of movement is away from, although the flip side is it's so much easier to find stuff online. I don't remember who mentioned the internet, but it was so great for my purposes to be able to just go to FBI.gov and download all these COINTELPRO documents that they've made available. Or you mentioned archive.org, by the way. I mean, it is so much easier to write a book when there's archive.org with all sorts of wonderful old entire books, about the Puritans that were published hundreds of years ago, now up there on go to archive.org, everyone. I'm sorry, I gave a commercial and I forgot if I answered your question, but hopefully I...
You mentioned at the beginning of the talk how America has always been a conspiratorial nation, a paranoid people, and I was sort of put in mind of the great Reason TV video, I think it was 2010, talking about vitriol in politics. Are we criticizing each other too harshly? Are we just is it just, you know, a shouting match, et cetera, et cetera? And the video pointed out that back in, you know, 1800 or whatever, it was even more vitriolic, and people were calling each other even more names. And so I'm wondering if the conspiracy theories you saw towards the beginning of American history were more outrageous or less credible or anything like that.
Well, I won't try to quantify it, but I mean, if you want to hear about, I mean, the Jeffersonians and the Federalists had such complicated conspiracy theories about and vitriolic ones about each other. And there was one at John Adams's administration. He planned to unite his family with the royal house of Great Britain, the bridegroom to be king of America. You know, there certainly was no shortage of that sort of vitriolic, yeah.
And one would like to think that, you know, the rise of education, et cetera, would have dampened that a little bit, but perhaps not.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not like people were writing pamphlets were ill-educated at that point. You know, I mean, it's very well-educated people.
True.
Recently, there's been release of government archives that substantiate conspiracy theories that, or you might say, the people basically knew to be true over the years about the CIA fomenting the overthrow of Mossadegh.
Yeah.
Also sort of saying, well, Area 51 does exist. Do you have, not that I'm trying to start a new conspiracy theory, but do you see any reason why these things are happening? And do you think there's any attempt to sort of get attention away from PRISM and
I don't know why the CIA just chose this moment to reveal it. And they may well have said why they did it. I just read the headline. You know, I didn't read all of the stories. So I don't know what the source of these recent. I mean, I will say that it's the British government actually sort of at regular intervals, you know, releases old documents, and sometimes there's some pretty amazing. There's one in there. This, of course, is not in the book because it's British, and I'm hoping I'm remembering it right. But there was a UFO cover-up that was. It was not they were covering up the existence of UFOs. It was like they were covering up their failure to spot any or something. I don't know. I shouldn't be saying this extemporaneously, but it was like this great sort of moment of bureaucratic ass covering that can spiral into all sorts of suspicions later. So. Anyone? No. So the last sentence has ass in it, apparently. C-SPAN, you know. Yeah. I should have insisted you call me the honorable speaker while I was here. All right, I guess that's it. So, thank you.
Is there a nonfiction author or book you'd like to see featured on Book TV?